This is a continuation of The Old Front Line by John Masefield, containing the third of 3 parts. To the north of Mametz the ground rises. From the eyrie of the salient one can look over it, and away to the north to big rolling chalk land, most of it wooded. Mametz Wood is a dark expanse to the front. To the right of it are other woods, Byzantine woods, big and little, and beyond them, rather to the right, and only just visible as a few sticks upon the skyline, are 2 other woods, High Wood, like a ghost in the distance, and the famous and terrible wood of Delville. High Wood is nearly 5 miles away and a little out of the picture. The other wooded heights are about 3 miles away. All that line of high ground marked by woods was the enemy's second line, which, with a few slight exceptions, was our front line before the end of the 3rd week of the battle. From this hill top of the salient the lines run down the north-eastern snout of the hill and back across the valley so as to shut in Mametz. Then they run eastward for a couple of miles, up to and across a plateau in front of the hamlet of Carnoy, which was just within our line. From our line, in this bare and hideous field, little could be seen but the slope up to the enemy line. At one point, where the road or lane from Carnoy to Montauban crossed the enemy line, there was a struggle for the power to see, and as a result of the struggle mines and countermines were sprung here, till the space between the lines is now a chaos of pits and chasms full of water. The country here is an expanse of smoothish, tilted slopes, big, empty and lonely, and crossed, at about the middle point, by a strange narrow gut or gully, up which the railway once ran to Montauban. No doubt there are places in the English chalk counties which resemble this sweep of country, but I know of none so bare or so featureless. The ground is of the reddish earth which makes such bad mud. The slopes are big and gradual, either up or down. Little breaks the monotony of the expanse except a few copses or sites of copses. The eye is always turning to the distance. In front, more than half a mile away, the ground reaches its highest point in the ridge or bank which marks the road to Montauban. The big gradual sweep up is only broken by lines of trenches and by mud heaped up from the road. Some of the trees which once made Montauban pleasant and shady still stand over little heaps of brick and solitary iron gate which show where the village used to stand. Rather to the right of this, and nearer to our lines, are some irregular red heaps with girders protruding from them. This is the enemy fortress of the brickworks of Montauban. Beyond this, still further to the right, behind the old enemy line, the ground loses its monotony and passes into lovely and romantic sweeping valleys, which our men could not see from their lines. Well behind our English lines in this district, and above the dip where Carnoy stands, the 4th of the 4 roads from Albert runs, eastward along a ridge, topped between a double row of noble trees which have not suffered very severely, except at their eastern end. Just north of this road, and a little below it on the slopes of the ridge, is the village of Maricourt. Our line turns to the southeast opposite Montauban and curves in towards the ridge so as to run just outside Maricourt, along the border of a little wood to the east of the houses. From all the high ground to the north of it, from the enemy's second line and beyond, the place is useful to give a traveller his bearings. The line of plane trees along the road on the ridge and the big clumps of trees round the village are landmarks which cannot be mistaken from any part of the field. Little is to be seen from our line outside Maricourt Wood, except the enemy line a little beyond it and the trees of other woods behind it. The line turns to the south, parallel with the wood, crosses the 4th road, which goes on towards Peronne, and goes down some difficult, rather lovely, steep chalk slopes, wooded in parts, to the ruins of Fardney Mill on the Somme River. The Somme River is here a very beautiful expanse of clear chalk water like a long wandering shallow lake. Through this shallow lake the river runs in half a dozen channels, which are parted and thwarted in many places by marsh, reed beds, osier plots, and tracts of swampy woodland. There is nothing quite like it in England. The riverbed is pretty generally between 500 and 600 yards across. Nearly 2 miles above the place where the old enemy line comes down to the bank, the river thrusts suddenly northwestward in a very noble great horseshoe, the bend of which comes at Farney where our lines touched it. The enemy line touched the horseshoe close to our own at a curious wooded bank or slope, known from its shape on the map, which is like a cocked hat, as the Chapeau de Gendarme. Just behind our lines, at the bend, the horseshoe sweeps round to the south. The riverbed at once broadens to about 2/3 of a mile, and the river, in 4 or 5 main channels, passes under a most beautiful sweep of steep chalk cliff, not unlike some of the chalk country near Arundel. These places marked the end of the British sector at the time of the beginning of the battle. On the south or left bank of the Somme River the ground was held by the French. Such was our old front line at the beginning of the battle, and so the travellers of our race will strive to picture it when they see the ground under the crops of coming Jullahs. It was never anything but a makeshift, patched together, and held, God knows how, against greater strength. Our strongest places were the half-dozen built-up observation posts at the mines near Fricourt-Serre and La Boisselle. For the rest, our greatest strength was but a couple of sandbags deep. There was no concrete in any part of the line, very few iron girders, and not many iron humpies or elephant backs to make the roofs of dugouts. The whole line gives the traveller the impression that it was improvised, as it was by amateurs with few tools and few resources, as best they could in a time of need and danger. Like the old, hurriedly built long walls at Athens it sufficed, and like the old camps of Caesar it served, till our men could take the much finer lines of the enemy. A few words may be said about those enemy lines. They were very different lines from ours. The defences of the enemy front line varied a little in degree, but hardly at all in kind, throughout the battlefield. The enemy wire was always deep, thick, and securely staked with iron supports, which were either crossed like the letter X, or upright, with loops to take the wire, and shaped at one end like corkscrews, so as to screw into the ground. The wire stood on these supports on a thick web, about 4 feet high and from 30 to 40 feet across. The wire used was generally as thick as sailors' marline stuff, or 2 twisted rope yarns. It contained, as a rule, some 16 barbs to the foot. The wire used in front of our lines was generally galvanized, and remained grey after months of exposure. The enemy wire, not being galvanized, rusted to a black color, and shows up black at a great distance. In places this web or barrier was supplemented with tripwire, or wire placed just above the ground, so that the artillery observing officers might not see it, and so not cause it to be destroyed. This tripwire was as difficult to cross as the wire of the entanglements. In one place, near the Y-Rain at Beaumont-Hamel, this tripwire was used with thin iron spikes, a yard long of the kind known as calthrops. The spikes were so placed in the ground that about 1 foot of spike projected. The scheme was that our men should catch their feet in the tripwire, fall on the spikes, and be transfixed. In places, in front of the front line in the midst of his wire, sometimes even in front of the wire, the enemy had carefully hidden snipers and machine gun posts. Sometimes these outside posts were connected with his front line trench by tunnels, sometimes they were simply shell holes, slightly altered with a spade, to take the snipers and the gunners. These outside snipers had some success in the early parts of the battle. They caused losses among our men by firing in the midst of them, and by shooting them in the backs after they had passed. Usually the posts were small oblong pans in the mud in which the men lay. Sometimes they were deep narrow graves in which the men stood to fire through a funnel in the earth. Here and there, where the ground was favourable, especially when there was some little knop, hillock, or bulge of ground just outside their line, as near Gomecourt Park and close to the sunken road at Beaumont-Hamel, he placed several such posts together. Outside Gomecourt, a slight lynchet near the enemy line was prepared, for at least a dozen such posts invisible from any part of our line, and not easily to be picked out by photograph, and so placed as to sweep at least a mile of no man's land. When these places had been passed, and the enemy wire, more or less cut by our shrapnel, had been crossed, our men had to attack the enemy fire trenches of the first line. These, like the other defences, varied in degree, but not in kind. They were, in the main, deep, solid trenches, dug with short bays or zigzags in the pattern of the Greek key or badger's earth. They were seldom less than 8 feet, and sometimes as much as 12 feet deep. Their sides were riveted or held from collapsing by strong wickerwork. They had good, comfortable standing slabs or banquettes on which the men could stand to fire. As a rule, the parapets were not built up with sandbags as ours were. In some parts of the line, the front trenches were strengthened at intervals of about 50 yards by tiny forts or fortlets made of concrete, and so built into the parapet that they could not be seen from without, even 5 yards away. These fortlets were pierced with a foot-long slip, for the muzzle of a machine gun, and were just big enough to hold the gun and one gunner. In the forward wall of the trenches were the openings of the shafts which led to the front-line dugouts. The shafts are all of the same pattern. They have open mouths about 4 feet high, and slant down into the earth for about 20 feet, at an angle of 45 degrees. At the bottom of the stairs which led down are the living rooms and barracks, which communicate with each other, so that if a shaft collapse the men below may still escape by another. The shafts and living rooms are strongly propped and panelled with wood, and this has led to the destruction of most of the few which survived our bombardment. While they were needed as billets, our men lived in them. Then the wood was removed, and the dugout and shaft collapsed. During the bombardment before an attack, the enemy kept below in his dugouts. If one shaft were blown in by a shell, they passed to the next. When the fire lifted to let the attack begin, they raced up the stairs with their machine guns and had them in action within a minute. Sometimes the fire was too heavy for this, for trench, parapet, shafts, dugouts, wood, and fortlets were pounded out of existence, so that no man could say that a line had ever run there, and in these cases the garrison was destroyed in the shelters. This happened in several places, though all the enemy dugouts were kept equipped with pioneer tools by which buried men could dig themselves out. The direction of the front-line trenches was so inclined with bends, juts, and angles as to give flanking fire upon attackers. At some little distance behind the front line, 100 yards or so, was a second fire line, wired like the first, though less elaborate, and generally without concrete fortlets. This second line was usually as well sited for fire as the front line. There were many communication trenches between the two lines. Half a mile behind the second line was a third support line, and behind this, running along the whole front, a mile or more away, was the prepared second main position, which was in every way like the front line, with wire, concrete fortlets, dugouts, and a difficult glacis for the attacker to climb. The enemy batteries were generally placed behind banks or lynchets which gave good natural cover, but in many places he mounted guns in strong permanent emplacements, built up of timber balks, within a couple of miles, at Fricourt within a quarter of a mile, of his front line. In woods from the high trees of which he could have clear observation, as in the Bezent in Bernafay, and Trones Woods, he had several of these emplacements, and also stout concrete fortlets for heavy single guns. All the enemy position on the battlefield was well gunned at the time of the beginning of the battle. In modern war, it is not possible to hide preparations for an attack on a wide front. Men have to be brought up, trenches have to be dug, the artillery has to prepare, and men, guns and trenches have to be supplied with food, water, shells, sandbags, props, and revetments. When the fire on any sector increases tenfold, while the roads behind the lines are thronged with 5 times the normal traffic of troops and lorries, and new trenches, the attack or jumping off trenches, are being dug in front of the line, a commander cannot fail to know that an attack is preparing. These preparations must be made and cannot be concealed from observers in the air or on the ground. The enemy knew very well that we were about to attack upon the Somme front, but did not know at which point to expect the main thrust. To be ready, in any case, he concentrated guns along the sector. It seems likely that he expected our attack to be an attempt to turn Bapaume by a thrust from the west, by Gommecourt, Puisieux, Grandcourt. In all this difficult sector his observations and arrangements for cross-fire were excellent. He concentrated a great artillery here. It is a legend among our men that he brought up 100 batteries to defend Gommecourt alone. In this sector, and in one other place a little to the south of it, his barrage upon our trenches before the battle was very accurate, terrible, and deadly. Our attacks were met by a profuse machine gun fire from the trench parapets and from the hidden pits between and outside the lines. There was not very much rifle fire in any part of the battle, but all the hotly fought for strongholds were defended by machine guns to the last. It was reported that the bodies of some enemy soldiers were found chained to their guns, and that on the bodies of others were intoxicating pills, designed to madden and infuriate the takers before an attack. The fighting in the trenches was mainly done by bombing with hand grenades, of which the enemy had several patterns, all effective. His most used type was a grey tin cylinder, holding about a pound of explosive, and screwed to a wooden baton or handle about a foot long for the greater convenience of throwing. Early in the spring of 1916, it was determined that an attack should be made by our armies upon these lines of the enemy, so as to bring about a removal of the enemy guns and men, then attacking the French at Verdun and the Russians on the eastern front. Preparations for this attack were made throughout the first half of the year. New roads were cut, old roads were remitold, new lines of railways were surveyed and laid, and supplies and munitions were accumulated not far from the front. Pumping stations were built and wells were sunk for the supply of water to the troops during the battle. Fresh divisions were brought up and held ready behind the line. An effort was made to check the enemy's use of aeroplanes. In June, Our air service in the Somme sector made it so difficult for the enemy to take photographs over our lines that his knowledge of our doings along the front of the planned battle was lessened and thwarted. At the same time, many raids were made by our aeroplanes upon the enemy's depots and magazines behind his front. Throughout June, our infantry raided the enemy line in many places to the north of the planned battle. It seems possible that these raids led him to think that our coming attack would be made wholly to the north of the Ancre River. During the latter half of June, our armies concentrated a very great number of guns behind the front of the battle. The guns were of every kind, from the field gun to the heaviest howitzer. Together they made what was at that time by far the most terrible concentration of artillery ever known upon a battlefield. Vast stores of shells of every known kind were made ready and hourly increased. As the guns came into battery, they opened intermittent fire, so that by the 20th of June, the fire along our front was heavier than it had been before. At the same time, the fire of the machine guns and trench mortars in our trenches became hotter and more constant. On the 24th of June, this fire was increased, by system, along the front designed for the battle, and along the French front to the south of the Somme, until it reached the intensity of a fire of preparation. Knowing, as they did, that an attack was to come, the enemy made ready and kept on the alert. Throughout the front, they expected the attack for the next morning. The fire was maintained throughout the night, but no attack was made in the morning, except by aeroplanes. These raided the enemy observation balloons, destroyed 9 of them, and made it impossible for the others to keep in the air. The shelling continued all that day, searching the line and particular spots with intense fire and much asphyxiating gas. Again the enemy prepared for an attack in the morning, and again there was no attack, although the fire of preparation still went on. The enemy said, "Tomorrow will make 3 whole days of preparation. The English will attack tomorrow." But when the morning came, there was no attack, only the never-ceasing shelling, which seemed to increase as time passed. It was now difficult and dangerous to move within the enemy lines. Relieving exhausted soldiers, carrying out the wounded, and bringing up food and water to the front became terrible feats of war. The fire continued and increased all that day and all the next day and the day after that. It darkened the days with smoke and lit the nights with flashes. It covered the summer landscape with a kind of haze of hell, earth-colored above fields and reddish above villages, from the dust of blown mud and brick flung up into the air. The tumult of these days and nights cannot be described nor imagined. The air was without wind yet, it seemed in a hurry with the passing of death. Men knew not which they heard, a roaring that was behind and in front, like a presence, or a screaming that never ceased to shriek in the air. No thunder was ever so terrible as that tumult. It broke the drums of the ears when it came singly, but when it rose up along the front and gave tongue together in full cry, it humbled the soul. With the roaring, crashing, and shrieking came a racket of hammers from the machine guns, till men were dizzy and sick from the noise which thrust between skull and brain, and beat out thought. With the noise came also a terror and an exultation that one should hurry, like the shrieking shells, into the pits of fire opening on the hills. Every night in all this week the enemy said, "The English will attack tomorrow," and in the front lines prayed that the attack might come, that so an end, any end, might come to the shelling. It was fine, cloudless, summer weather, not very clear, for there was a good deal of heat, haze, and of mist in the nights and early mornings. It was hot yet brisk during the days. The roads were thick in dust. Clouds and streamers of chalk dust floated and rolled over all the roads leading to the front, till men and beasts were grey with it. At 6:30 in the morning of the 1st of July, all the guns on our front quickened their fire to a pitch of intensity never before attained. Intermittent darkness and flashing so played on the enemy line from Gommecourt to Maricourt that it looked like a reef on a loppy day. For one instant it could be seen as a white rim above the wire. Then some cumber of a big shell struck it fair and spouted it black aloft. Then another and another fell, and others of a new kind came and made a different darkness, through which now and then some fat white wreathing devil of explosion came out and danced. Then it would show out, with gaps in it, and with some of it level with the field, till another cumber would fall and go up like a breaker and smash it out of sight again. Over all the villages on the field there floated a kind of bloody dust from the blasted bricks. In our trenches after 7 o'clock on that morning, our men waited under a heavy fire for the signal to attack. Just before 7:30, the mines at 6 points went up with a roar that shook the earth and brought down the parapets in our lines. before the blackness of their burst had thinned or fallen, the hand of time rested on the half-hour mark, and along all that old front line of the English there came a whistling and a crying. The men of the first wave climbed up the parapets in tumult, darkness, and the presence of death, and having done with all pleasant things, advanced across the no-man's land to begin the Battle of the Somme. The end. Best audio books for free. Hopes that you have enjoyed this production of The Old Front Line by John Masefield. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content.